cross your legs and then lower yourself to the ground. And then without putting your hand on the ground, if you can you stand back up without putting your knee on the ground or hand on the ground or losing your balance? The first thing that I would have you do is start to sit on the ground in the evening for 20 to 30 minutes while you're watching TV, while you're writing emails. That if something is important, you should probably do it every day.
Dr. Kelly, one of the first vital sign or self-evaluatory home test you prescribed for a community was that sit and rise test. It is the most fundamental mobility test if I'm not wrong. So tell us the science and biomechanics of sitting as well as rising up in a right manner.
What we should be thinking about, again, is that our bodies are immensely durable. And if we look at 2.5 million years of evolution, right? And really, we have the same bodies that we did 10,000 years ago. I'm a little fatter and your femur is a little longer, but it's the same body. You would recognize yourself 10,000 years ago. And so if we look at the behaviors of even that short time, we did a lot of sleeping on the ground, cooking on the ground, toileting on the ground, interacting on the ground. And getting up and getting down is actually not a very big task. Every child can do it. And if you live in an environment where you sleep on the ground or work on the ground, even cooking around a fire, you see that getting up and down is not a task that we even have to think about. It doesn't require that much strength. I've seen very, very old people get up and down off the ground who traditionally have done that. You know, I was on a trip in Japan and staying in a room where I had to sleep on the ground and all the toilets, and it's not a big deal. But suddenly when we start to live lives in more of a modern way, and I don't mean Western, I mean modern, what we see is that we aren't taking our bodies through their normative range of motion very often. And so if we look at the movement language of a typical human being, ideally you would do something that touched all of the shapes and positions that you were capable of during the day. And that might be naturally getting up and down off the ground, carrying resources, right? Throwing things. I think if we look 10,000 years ago, what we would see is, well, we have an ankle that's being asked to be an ankle in its normal physiologic evolutionary sense, more than if I'm wearing a cushioned shoe and I only am on flat surfaces and I never have to go up and down something steep. And the same thing I think is true of the hip, is that oftentimes when we ask people to do this sit and rise test, it's one of the first times as adults that we're confronted with a task that we thought was easy, that we used to be able to do, but something in our environment and our behaviors with the environment have changed. So what's nice about this sit and rise test, doing it cross-legged. So basically the test is just cross your legs and then lower yourself to the ground. And then without putting your hand on the ground, if you can you stand back up without putting your knee on the ground or hand on the ground or losing your balance? And what's interesting about that is that test actually doesn't measure full flexion. It doesn't measure ankle range of motion. You can do it and just have mediocre, just have very average range of motion and be able to express that. But when we ask people to do it and they struggle with that, oftentimes it's the first sort of interesting assessment where they're saying, hey, why can't I do this? And the reason they can't do it is they lack the range of motion in their hips to be able to do it. They lack the range of motion in their knees to be able to sort of express that position. And the reason that's important is that, again, if you see a physician, very rarely is your physician asking you about the health of your joints and your range of motion. We might be talking about arthritis in a certain joint, but we're still not giving our clients, our athletes, our patients sort of an assessment for how well they're using. Again, if I'm your physician and I just flex and extend your elbow, that's one thing, but that doesn't tell me how you're using your elbow in real life. Again, if I lay you down on the plinth and I just move your hip around, it gives me information, but it doesn't tell me how you problem solve. So here we have this really simple and elegant problem. Can you get up and down off the ground while holding 2 cups of tea, right? That's all we're asking, or a beer and a tea, whatever is into it, or holding your baby and get up off the ground. And chances are, if you struggle with that, it can give us insight into saying, hey, your body is adapting to your environment, and you may have some blind spots in your physical practices. And the problem with not having access to our range of motion is that what we start to see is when we lose access to the hip range of motion, just the hip doing what the hip should be able to do, suddenly we see things like fall risk increase. That when the ankle is stiff, fall risk increases. When we see that you have fewer movement choices, you're more likely to stumble and fall. The number one reason in the United States that people end up in the emergency room is falls. And that's across all age demographics. But the number one way to kill yourself in America as an older person is to go ahead and fall above the age of 65, where you fracture a hip. And then you, as you know, as a physician, it's a quick downward spiral. You lose your muscle mass, you lose your agency, you lose your control. So suddenly what we're looking at too is this dynamic mobility, this dynamic range of motion. We have got balance in there. We've got, the expression of coordination in there. We've got some basic range of motion. Again, all we're talking about is getting up and down off the ground. And the reason we think that this is an important test is that it allows us to sort of always be checking our range of motion and saying, hey, it's not a problem. Or I've been running a lot, or I've been traveling a lot. I've been in med school a lot. And suddenly something, a part of my body has changed. And that shouldn't be so radical. It's the same reason why we check your heart rate, or we check your blood pressure, or we look at your blood panel, because these things change over time based on our stress, based on our nutrition, based on our histories, right? So we want to make sure that people understand that we have a whole set of vital signs around our own health, right, that are metrics of our physiology. Let's go ahead and include some range of motion into this language.
For example, I am not able to do it. I am not able to sit and rise without any support. Then what would be your prescriptive practical implementations which I should do so that I can perform the exact biokinetic chain in the perfect form?
What's amazing is that if there was a contest where we could judge your sit to rise, we could talk about perfect form. But what we see is that your body anthropometry, the length of your femurs are a little bit different than mine. The shape of your hips are a little different than mine. That's all fine, because ultimately human beings have been getting up and down off the ground forever. And no one has such a special hip or unique ankle range of motion that they can't. There's a perfect technique. But what this says is that you may have not be thinking about a few interventions that are putting you in this position. The first thing that I would have you do is start to sit on the ground in the evening for 20 to 30 minutes while you're watching TV, while you're writing emails, while you're doing notes. And the reason we do that is that anytime we have a complex system, we look for simple solutions. We don't try to add complexity to the system. So when we have a complex movement system or complex behavioral system, and I add another very complex behavioral system, what we see is it doesn't work, right? And all the physicians listening will nod their heads. If I have a disease and I give someone a very complicated drug regimen, the adherence or the compliance is very low because it's so complicated. So I have this complicated thing matching with a complicated thing. So whenever we can, we look at interventions where we see high levels of adherence so that we can actually have people do what they need to do and they don't have to summon willpower or follow complex directions. So in this order, and this is important across any body position I'm trying to change, squatting, pressing, being more powerful. There's a famous coach here in the United States, Dan Gable, who was a wrestling coach. And he said, if something is important, you should probably do it every day. And one of the first things that we want to do is say, hey, how can we expose your hips to more of these end range positions for longer? Because it turns out that what often happens is that I give you a complex intervention as a physical therapist that you do for 1 or 2 minutes, a couple times a week. That may be insufficient load or exposure to actually have a meaningful change in a tissue that is exposed to other things in the environment, or you're just a big, strong human being and your hips are tight. And it just may be that this insufficient 1 or 2 minute intervention works for a really detrained, very small human, but doesn't work for an athlete. And so one of the things that we found is that sitting on the ground in the evening in as many positions as you like, sit crisscross applesauce, sit 90-90, put your legs out in front of you, kneeling. It's a way of spending a lot of time at some very key end range positions. And that's the first order of business. Now, look, those positions may not address all aspects of the movement system. They may not mobilize the joint capsules. They may not specifically target musculature. They may not, but what we're saying is, let's tell the brain that these are positions that we value. The body will remodel and remap and give us better permission to be able to access those shapes, especially if I'm asking you to watch TV. As your doctor, I'm saying, hey, I want you to sit on the ground and watch TV. I want you to watch Indian Matchmaker, and I want you to sit on the ground, and you can do that. And I think what's nice is that suddenly we have a behavioral intervention where we start to see real changes in people's range of motion, and more importantly, the expression of that range of motion, which is suddenly in our cyclists, we find that they ride faster. In our weightlifters, we find that they can run and jump and lift more. And what's nice about that is then suddenly, if you're on the ground for 20 or 30 minutes, because that's what we do in the evenings, there happens to be a ball or a roller next to you on the floor. And now we have a perfect segue into saying, hey, let's become curious. Are there other tools and ways where we can influence how the brain is having access to the movement system? And that might be mobilization, that might be more specific positions. Look, if you're sitting on the ground, you might as well be doing pigeon pose or goose pose, right? Because it's really easy to start working your external rotation since you're already there. But if I have to ask you during your workday to get on the ground, you're never going to do it, right? And the gym is a great place to train, to talk and find blind spots, to be very complicated. But can we move, can we protect the gym time? And more importantly, can we move some of these other interventions into the home where I have time and agency and control?
दोस्तों, ये वीडियो अगर आपको वैल्यूएबल लगा तो इसे लाइक कर अपने सारे दोस्तों से इसे शेयर कीजिएगा। इस चैनल को सब्सक्राइब तो आप कर ही लेंगे। चलिए मिलते हैं।